A deep dive into one of the most contentious, confusing, and admittedly entertaining accounts of alleged ET encounters in modern American history requires both an open mind and a strong sense of humor. The more you realize that reality sometimes outdoes fiction in the most unexpected and thoroughly bewildering ways.
They saw me hanging outside my window in a beam of light.
There were 23 witnesses.
I thought it was a movie. Special effects.
I don't know why they keep it from the public.
Close.
It
There was
will
no
become
response.
the greatest case.
Into our deep dive.
That's
What
when
the
I did
hell
open
happened?
my eyes and I was
All the time.
there was this thing actually
happened.
It is 1989, the year before the 1990s arrive with their inevitable technological optimism and the false promise that the internet will solve all our problems. In Manhattan, a woman named Linda Napolitano is about to have the kind of night that would make most people question their grip on sanity, the laws of physics, and whether they should have stayed in bed and pretended everything was normal. Instead, she woke up paralyzed, surrounded by beings described as pale, humanoid creatures with large, round heads and enormous black eyes. Then she floated through solid objects while being escorted by these mysterious visitors, and by the end of it all, she would become the central figure in a narrative so tangled, so improbable, and so thoroughly documented with such questionable documentation that it would eventually land on Netflix as a documentary miniseries called The Manhattan Alien Abduction, which is either the best proof that wild stories can captivate millions or the best evidence that we collectively enjoy watching train wrecks unfold in slow motion. Act 1. The Night Everything Got Weird. Part 1. On the evening in question, shortly after 3 a.m. on November 30th, 1989, Linda Napolitano was in her apartment in Lower Manhattan, specifically in a building not far from the Brooklyn Bridge, when she began to feel an odd sensation starting in her feet, a numbness that crept upward like an unwanted guest who had let themselves in and decided to make themselves completely at home in her nervous system. The numbness was unusual, sure, but what came next was the kind of thing that separates a bad dream from a genuinely alarming situation where you start wondering if you need to call someone. When she opened her eyes, standing at the foot of her bed was a creature that looked nothing like anything she expected to see in her bedroom at 3 in the morning. This being was pale, humanoid in shape, but decidedly inhuman in appearance, with a disproportionately large, round head and dark eyes that seemed to take up most of its face, the kind of eyes that probably belonged on an animal, not a bipedal creature standing in your bedroom in the middle of the night. If you have ever woken from sleep with that disorienting feeling where reality seems slightly off, multiply that by 1,000, and you might approach what Linda experienced in that moment, except worse. Because this was not a dream, or at least that is what she insists to this day. But wait, there is more, because one being was apparently not enough to make the evening sufficiently unsettling. From behind the curtains emerged another creature, and then another, and then several more, until there were roughly 5 to 7 visitors in her bedroom, which is either a remarkably well-coordinated team effort or perhaps the most inappropriately timed home invasion in recorded history. These beings moved silently and slowly, which sounds almost polite if not for the fact that they were advancing toward a paralyzed woman in her own bed. Linda called out for her husband, Steve, who was sleeping right there beside her, presumably unaware that his bedroom was about to become the setting for the most extraordinary event in their entire marriage. He did not respond. She called again, but Steve continued sleeping with the persistence of someone who had either taken industrial-strength sedatives or was simply the world's heaviest sleeper. The numbness that had started in her feet had now reached her neck, immobilizing her almost completely. When she tried to scream, she heard not a sound from her lips, but rather a voice inside her mind, a presence that issued a command, silent but unmistakable. Be quiet, do not scream. And remarkably, Linda found herself complying, whether because she was terrified, because the command was somehow irresistible, or because she recognized on some level that screaming would accomplish nothing. She went silent. Then came the levitation. Linda felt herself rising above the bed, floating upward into the air like some kind of reverse gravity experiment gone right instead of wrong. She drifted from the bedroom into the living room, while her pale visitors accompanied her in their soundless procession. Then, something truly impossible happened, or at least it seemed impossible. She floated through a closed window and past the safety bars that had been installed on the exterior of the apartment to prevent people from falling or invading from outside, except that she did not break the glass, did not disturb the bars. She simply passed through them as if they were not there, hovering outside her 12th-story apartment surrounded by a bright blue light that illuminated the night sky over Manhattan.
Here she is floating over the New York skyline.
Linda claims that she is being pulled towards a giant UFO. As Linda is pulled into the UFO, the surrounding neighborhood experiences a major power outage.
And not just in the buildings, but on the street also. Cars were dying right in the middle of the street.
The craft itself, when it came into view, was described as saucer-shaped, like something out of a 1950s B-movie, except that Linda was allegedly living inside the B-movie, rather than watching it from the safety of a dark theater. She ascended gradually into this craft along with her visitors, crossing from the night sky of New York City into an interior space that she would later describe as containing volcanic fire, a detail that raises questions about ET engineering standards and fire safety regulations. Or perhaps suggests that Linda was experiencing something far stranger than the straightforward encounter narrative might suggest. Once inside, the beings guided her down a hallway furnished with benches, which is somehow both the most mundane and most surreal detail imaginable. Various rooms seemed to line this hallway, and as they passed by, Linda heard doors hissing open and closing, a sound that belongs in either a spaceship or a hospital. The beings conversed among themselves in a language that sounded entirely unintelligible to Linda, a series of sounds that her mind could not parse into anything resembling human speech. Eventually, they arrived at a brightly lit room with a long table at its center, a setting that inspired panic in Linda. Her mind began to race with thoughts about what might happen to her in a room with a table and beings who were clearly capable of moving her through solid matter. She started shouting in her mind, her thoughts somehow translating into an alien language, a detail that raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness and communication across species lines, or suggests that Linda possessed some form of latent telepathic ability, or more skeptically, that the entire encounter was a vivid dream or hallucination dressed up in the clothes of alien contact. One of the beings placed a hand over her mouth, a gesture that seems almost gentle, except for the context of her paralysis and captivity. Then it produced a long medical instrument and inserted it into her right nostril, a procedure that none of us would willingly consent to under any circumstances. Yet another being approached and began running its hand through her hair and placing a comforting hand on her cheek as if attempting to soothe her during what was clearly an invasive medical procedure. When Linda asked why she was there, what the purpose of this encounter was, the being replied in a way that translated to her mind as just for a visit, which is perhaps the most understated response possible to an encounter that involved paralysis, levitation, passing through solid matter, and nasal instrumentation. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the experience shifted. Linda found herself able to move again. She sat up in her bed and heard a loud roar, as if the entire experience had been sucked back into a vortex of sound and sensation. She looked around and found herself in her bed, back in her apartment, back in the familiar surroundings of her bedroom at some impossible hour of the night. She tried to wake her husband, Steve, but he remained motionless, deep in a sleep so profound that nothing she did seemed to penetrate it. She ran to her son's room and found them similarly unresponsive. She checked on her youngest, Johnny, and found him too locked in whatever deep sleep had overcome him. She reportedly placed a mirror under her son's nose to confirm he was breathing, a practical gesture of maternal worry in the midst of what would otherwise be completely inexplicable circumstances. The witnesses emerge. Days or weeks later, depending on the timeline, a letter arrived at the apartment of Bud Hopkins, a ufologist who had been documenting cases that he believed represented genuine encounters between humans and extraterrestrial beings. Hopkins ran support groups for people who claim to have experienced ET encounters, which is either a genuine service to traumatized people or an echo chamber for sharing and reinforcing increasingly elaborate narratives depending on your perspective. The letter came from two men identifying themselves as Dan and Richard, police officers who claimed to have witnessed something extraordinary on the night in question. They described guilt that had been lingering, difficult emotions, and uncertainty about whether they should try to locate the woman they had allegedly seen being taken into a craft over the East River. Hopkins recognized the name mentioned in their letter. Linda Napolitano had been attending his support groups. This was remarkable. The first time Hopkins had received multiple witness accounts of the same event, corroboration from people outside of Linda's immediate circle, and subjective experience. Approximately 2 weeks after receiving the letter, Linda herself called Hopkins. She was agitated, speaking in rushed tones about two detectives named Richard and Dan who had just shown up at her door. It had been close to 11 p.m. when Linda heard the knock. Through the peephole, she saw two men in dark suits. They identified themselves as detectives. She let them in, and there, in her living room, stood Richard and Dan, the same men who had written the letter to Bud Hopkins, now manifested in physical form, with faces and voices and the ability to sit in her living room and discuss what they had all apparently witnessed. Act 2. The men in suits and the complications of credibility. According to Linda's account, Dan was somewhat aloof and distant, the kind of person who keeps their emotions locked away behind a professional facade. Richard, on the other hand, was kind but nervous. At one point during their conversation, Richard appeared on the verge of tears, suggesting that whatever he had witnessed had affected him deeply. The conversation lasted about 30 minutes, during which Linda recounted her experience in detail. She told them about the numbness, the beings, the levitation, the craft, and crucially, she told them about how her husband and children had been placed into such a profound sleep that she could not rouse them for several hours. She had put a mirror under her son's nose to check for breath, a detail that humanizes the experience and suggests genuine maternal concern. Even in the midst of what seems like fantasy, Linda asked Richard and Dan to contact Bud Hopkins and confirm her story, to provide their witness testimony and help validate her account. They declined, uncomfortable with the idea of stepping into the public eye with such an extraordinary claim. They had good reasons to be hesitant. Associating oneself with claims of ET encounters can damage professional credibility in ways that are difficult to recover from. After they left, Linda thought the matter might be over, but it was not. Another letter arrived for Hopkins, this time accompanied by an audio tape. The tape contained Richard's voice, speaking alone, recounting the events of the night that Linda had been taken. He expressed hope that his recording would be useful to Bud. Despite his unwillingness to publicly confirm the story, he described his memory of Linda's expressionless, pale face and the three beings escorting her into the craft. The audio documentation added a layer of credibility to the narrative, or at least it seemed to.
The partner was very disoriented and embarrassed. This is what he said to me.
Suppose Linda has already spoken to you about our unexpected visit to her apartment one evening. Indeed, it was very uncomfortable, to say the least. The subject matter was the strangest ever in my line of work. With my binoculars, I could see Linda was there in this beam of light. My partner screamed. I felt as though I had lost my breath. What happened left us all victims to circumstance. After actually seeing her and speaking with her, we could see just how frightened and sincere she was. Please respect the importance of our credibility at work. It just can't be identified and be laughed at.
Richard and Dan were grappling with what they had witnessed. Richard coped by secretly watching Linda, positioning himself where he could see her without her knowing. It is a disturbing detail that gets lost in the larger narrative. The fact that one of the supposed witnesses was stalking Linda without her consent, though Richard apparently believed that seeing Linda in her everyday life, confirming her existence and normalcy, somehow eased his feelings of insanity, validated the experience by confirming that the woman existed and went about her life. Dan did not handle the stress as well. For Dan, seeing Linda was not comforting but rather a painful reminder of the incident, a trigger for anxiety and confusion. Dan sent Hopkins a letter expressing anger, fear, and embarrassment. The emotional toll of the encounter, or the claim of the encounter, had clearly affected him profoundly. Linda, for her part, noted a white van parked near her building. She felt watched. The November encounter remained the most distressing event in her life, or so she claimed. The feeling of being observed and studied was adding another layer of violation to an already disturbing experience, real or imagined. Trauma is trauma when you are experiencing it. Act 3. The unraveling of official identity. Hopkins decided to locate these detectives. He visited police precincts across the city, posted flyers asking for information about officers named Richard and Dan. No one came forward. No record existed of these two men in the NYPD. The reason became apparent when additional information arrived. Richard and Dan were not actually police officers at all. They had lied to Linda, or more accurately, they had misrepresented their professional identities in order to gain credibility and access. They were actually security personnel, providing protection for a man of considerable international significance. A man who happened to be driving to the downtown heliport on the night in question when their car stalled near Linda's building. All three of them witnessed something extraordinary in the sky. The man they were protecting was Javier Pérez de Cuellar, the Secretary General of the United Nations, a position that places someone in the upper echelon of global diplomacy and international visibility, which led Richard and Dan to impersonate police officers, a deception designed to protect their employer's privacy and reputation. While the Secretary General was apparently relieved to hear about Linda's safety, he wanted nothing further to do with the event. He had apparently seen enough. De Cuellar's representatives would later deny his involvement entirely, claiming he was asleep at home that night, which raises the question of how a man can simultaneously witness an extraordinary event and be asleep in his home. Richard and Dan, however, continued to struggle with their emotions. They could not simply move on and pretend the night had not happened. A few weeks later, Linda was walking to the supermarket when she ran into Richard. He invited her to take a ride in a nearby luxury car so they could talk. Linda declined, citing her errands, but she offered an invitation to come to her apartment later that evening. Richard insisted on the ride, becoming more forceful in his invitation.
Bud came up with this idea of wiring her for sound.
Testing. The microphone was in my pocket. The speaker was in my ear. One day, I was walking up Cherry Street, and I see this black car, and who's standing outside the car was Richard and Dan.
He's standing across the street, watching. God, I gotta get the hell out of here. Oh God, he's coming. I don't see him anywhere. What the hell is
I didn't want to get into the car. I didn't want to have anything to do with them, period. But here I was sitting in the car, and we just took off.
Checkpoint, you want it? No, I'm not white. It's not on. I need help. You really need help. Oh, stop it. Oh, no. What? Come here. Breathe.
That bastard, Dan, used to call me a half-breed.
Stop it.
He actually thought I was half human, half alien.
I want to go home. Why don't you let me out of the car?
And I took out the gun. I says to him, I'm holding a gun, and you better watch out, because I'm going to shoot your balls off. And he stopped the car, and I ran away and called Bud.
Hello?
Linda?
They cleared me by 317.
Oh, Linda, tell me what happened.
He went nuts. He grabbed me by my shoulders and started to shake me, so I was dizzy.
Oh, Linda.
Then I had this son of a bitch on tape.
Okay, Linda, get off film, come on over, okay?
Okay.
Okay, bye-bye.
Linda complied, though she found the entire situation absurd. They finally dropped her off at her apartment building, the Knickerbocker Village, located just off Catherine Slip and Cherry Street, ending the interrogation but not the strangeness. Act 4. Escalation, confusion, and the Lady of the Sands. Dan apologized for his behavior, admitting that there was no excuse for forcing Linda into a car and interrogating her for hours, but attributing it to the tremendous stress he had been under. It is a non-apology that attempts to explain but not fully justify. It was revealed that Richard, Dan, and Secretary General de Cuellar had all experienced a shared memory that had been triggered over the previous months. After the craft disappeared into the river, the three men found themselves on a beach where they saw Linda and three ETs digging in the sand for some odd reason. They heard the beings conversing in their alien language. When Linda and the ETs approached them, Linda held up a dead fish and accused them as her expression remained blank and strained and said, "Look and see what you have done." Then one of the ETs referred to her as the Lady of the Sands, a title that sounds simultaneously mystical and completely absurd, like something from a fantasy novel written by someone who had never actually been to a beach. Dan, in his continuing correspondence with Hopkins, expressed frustration at feeling like Linda was withholding information when they had questioned her in April. Perhaps she was scared. Perhaps she did not trust their intentions. They had become convinced that Linda was the Lady of the Sands, that she occupied some special category, some role that they did not yet understand. Dan confessed his annoyance with Linda, claiming that even if she flew to the moon in her own spacecraft, the distance would not be far enough for him, a comment that suggests his grip on reality was loosening considerably. He still wanted to have a sincere conversation with her. Though he acknowledged she would not want that conversation, he requested that Bud prepare Linda for a visit from him, and he insisted repeatedly that they, the ETs, and Linda and all the witnesses, did not kill the fish. Bud Hopkins decided to hypnotize Linda under regressive hypnosis, a technique that has been heavily criticized as a method for uncovering genuine memories since it is remarkably effective at generating false memories and reinforcing narratives that have been suggested to the subject.
At the foot of the bed. By now my knees are numb. And then it got on top of the bed and it crouched down, looked me straight in the eye, and hissed.
Under hypnosis, Linda remembered the beach, the digging for sand samples, the dead fish, the ETs conversing in their language. She remembered being called the Lady of the Sands, but could not explain the meaning of the title. She was uncertain about its significance, which raises questions about the whole endeavor. If the hypnosis was recovering genuine memories, why could she not remember what the title meant? Why did important details remain obscured? On October 15th, Dan apparently arrived at Linda's location in broad daylight and grabbed her, forcing her into his car. He was, by all accounts, not in a stable state of mind. During the drive, he pulled over, called her a half-breed, and kissed her repeatedly on the face while periodically grabbing her knee. The behavior suggests either a psychological breakdown or something darker and more difficult to articulate. They drove to a beach house on Long Island where Dan told Linda to make herself comfortable while he made coffee. Linda searched for a phone or any identifying information that might help her, finding nothing except two framed photographs, one showing Linda saying goodbye to her son Johnny, and another showing Linda by a lighthouse. Both pictures featured Linda, which raises questions about their provenance. Why did Dan have photographs of Linda in his beach house? How long had he been watching her? When Dan returned from the kitchen, he had a gift-wrapped box, which he instructed Linda to open and wear. The box contained a negligee. Linda refused, but seeing anger in Dan's eyes, she offered a compromise. She would wear it over her clothes. Dan agreed to this modification. Then something shifted. Dan went pale, fell to his knees, and began crying. He exclaimed, "It was you, Lady of the Sands?" As if a crucial piece of reality had suddenly crystallized for him, as if he had finally understood something that had eluded him all along. Linda, recognizing an opportunity, escaped onto the beach, ran outside, trying to put distance between herself and the man who seemed to be having a complete psychological dissolution. Dan caught up with her and attacked her, but Richard, who was apparently present at the beach house for reasons that remain unclear, intervened and de-escalated the situation, dragging Dan away and preventing further harm. The scene reads like the climax of a deeply disturbing psychological thriller. Act 5. The skeptics arrive and start asking questions. Investigators George Hansen, Richard Butler, and Joseph Stafula decided to examine the entire narrative with a skeptical eye. They interviewed Linda, conducted extensive research into the claims, examined the documentation, and came to the conclusion that the entire story was fabricated or at least heavily contaminated with fiction and invention. The first obstacle was obvious. Linda was the only direct witness to the actions of Richard and Dan. Their interrogation of her, the beach house, the violent encounter. However, there were audio tapes, recordings that other individuals had listened to. There were supposedly multiple witnesses to the core encounter itself. They investigated Janet Kimball, a woman who allegedly had her car stall on the Brooklyn Bridge during a related incident.
I'm standing at exactly the spot where this very strange event was seen at 3 a.m. really on November 30th, 1989. A woman was driving from Brooklyn to New York, right down here in the outer lane. Her car engine died, the lights went out, and she looked over to this building, the one in the distance with a little pointed roof, and at that point she saw a burst of light as a UFO hovering only a few feet above it turned on all of its lights. Two small figures below her and one above her.
When they examined her letter to Bud Hopkins, handwriting analysis indicated that the letter was written by Linda, not by Janet Kimball. It was a forgery. Possibly Linda impersonating another witness to create the illusion of corroboration. Linda also claimed her cousin Connie had been present during an attempted kidnapping. Bud contacted Connie. He came to believe that Linda had called him pretending to be her cousin, presenting herself as a separate witness to lend credibility to the narrative. These were significant blows to the story's credibility.
Bud and DeQuayar met in the VIP lounge at O'Hare Airport in Chicago, arranged by a reporter who had an appointment to do an interview with DeQuayar, was aware of this story, a colleague of Bud's, and essentially set up this opportunity for Hopkins to speak with the Secretary General.
The alleged meeting between Secretary General DeQuayar and Bud Hopkins at O'Hare Airport, supposedly a moment of crucial corroboration, had never been witnessed by anyone outside of Hopkins and DeQuayar. If the meeting had occurred at all, DeQuayar's representatives issued statements denying his involvement entirely, claiming he had been asleep at home on the night in question. An office statement from the Secretary General's team flatly rejected any suggestion of involvement. One of the major problems with Linda's account was her failure to report the assaults, the abduction, to law enforcement. When asked why she had not gone to the police, she cited fear for her safety and her family's safety. Even when Bud Hopkins encouraged her to file reports, she resisted. Skeptics pointed out that someone who had been assaulted and would reasonably be expected to file police reports. Yet no reports existed. Steve, Linda's husband, was largely silent during interviews. He had difficulty answering questions. Linda would often interject to help him remember events. Eventually, Steve left the interview early. Steve's reluctance to engage with the narrative might suggest skepticism about his wife's account, or it might suggest trauma and a desire to distance himself from the chaos. Linda's fascination with aliens and UFOs, and her contact with Bud Hopkins shortly after reading his book Intruders, suggests that her encounter narrative might have been influenced or inspired by what she had read. A sci-fi novel called Night Eyes was released a few months before Linda contacted Bud, and it contained elements similar to her account, suggesting possible narrative contamination or inspiration. The loading dock of the New York Post was located with a view of Lower Manhattan, and at 3 a.m., the dock would have been bustling with workers, loading trucks for the morning edition. Yet none of these workers reported seeing a UFO or anything unusual. When investigators interviewed the dock manager, they discovered he spent most of his shift in an office away from the actual loading area that would have faced Linda's apartment building. So the negative testimony was not as strong as skeptics claimed, but it was still a notable absence of corroborating witnesses in a densely populated area. Act 6. The Endless Complications and Uncertain Truths. From the loading zone of Linda's building, investigators determined it was impossible to see her residence. Casting further doubt on the skeptical argument about observable witnesses, Bud Hopkins maintained that Linda's story remained consistent over a span of 10 years. However, individuals who had attended her speeches at UFO conventions noted alterations in details over time. The story seemed to shift and change, certain elements being emphasized or de-emphasized depending on context. Linda initially stated she would receive 50% of any income generated from book sales or a potential movie deal related to her story. She later retracted this claim, then admitted she had been lying on purpose, then clarified that she had received a percentage, albeit a small one. Later, it was discovered that Linda had actually received between 15 and 25% of the profits from book sales, movie rights, or any other derivatives of her story. The shifting claims about financial arrangements fueled suspicion about her motivations. If Linda is fabricating this entire saga, she has managed to involve numerous individuals in the narrative. Bud Hopkins possesses multiple witness testimonials on both audio and video, which have been validated by some observers. However, Linda has also made increasingly outrageous claims that stretch credulity to breaking points. She asserted that she was part E.T., that she possessed immortal red blood cells, that she was a descendant of Joan of Arc, that she had been a professional singer in a renowned pop band. Oh wait, she actually was a singer? That she had met Cardinal O'Connor, that she had been invited to a private audience with the Pope, and that she had been present in the World Trade Center during the 9/11 attacks. These claims escalate from unusual to impossible. They suggest either an extraordinary life of unlikely coincidences, or a person who is either fabricating stories or suffering from a psychological condition that manifests as elaborate false memories or fantastical claims. Bud Hopkins was aware of these increasingly outlandish claims, but chose to omit them from his book. Including them would have undermined the credibility of his entire investigation. Supporters of Hopkins praise him as an exceptional and dedicated investigator, while critics point out that he had a strong preference for interviewing and hypnotizing individuals whose stories confirmed his existing belief in ET encounters. His investigations lacked the objectivity necessary for genuine scientific inquiry. According to his own wife, Carol, he prioritized crafting a compelling narrative rather than seeking objective truth. He reacted defensively and with anger when his story was questioned or challenged. His credibility as an objective investigator is therefore significantly compromised. He appeared to genuinely want to help individuals who felt frightened, ashamed, or isolated by their experiences. This made him susceptible to manipulation by people like Linda, or it made him a sincere advocate for people who had experienced genuine trauma. Depending on perspective, the complexity of human motivation means that Hopkins could simultaneously be a flawed investigator with built-in biases and a genuinely compassionate person trying to help others. These are not mutually exclusive categories. Speculation about Linda's motives centers on whether she was seeking attention or monetary gain. Her status transformed from being a housewife, a relatively ordinary position in American life, to becoming a celebrity within the UFO community, a role that she appeared to actively relish and enjoy. She gave speeches at conventions, participated in interviews, became a recognized figure in the world of paranormal investigation. For someone transitioning from ordinary domestic life, this kind of attention and notoriety could be intoxicating. It could serve as validation and confirmation that her life mattered, that her experiences were significant, that she was important. Despite the bizarre nature of this story, its authenticity remains unconfirmed even after 35 years. No individual has stepped forward to reveal the entire narrative as a deliberate hoax. This absence of confession does not prove the story is true. Absence of evidence is not evidence of presence. But it does mean that if the story is false, it has been maintained consistently and without confession for decades. The narrative ultimately hinges on Linda's testimony, creating a polarizing situation where observers must either believe in the entirety of the events or dismiss them completely. Accepting one part of her story means accepting all of it, because the encounters with Richard and Dan and the beach house incident are all interwoven. Rejecting one thread unravels the whole tapestry. Audiences are presented with all available information and left to form their own conclusions about what is credible, what is possible, and what belongs in the category of human experience we have not yet learned to explain. Act 7. Netflix's documentary reboot of Linda's case brought her decades-old encounters back into headlines, sparking renewed debate, investigative re-examinations, and a fresh wave of public curiosity that included think pieces, podcast deep dives, and social media threads. The series framed her story for a new generation while also prompting skeptics and supporters to revisit old evidence and interview transcripts. Since the program aired, Linda has mostly receded from mainstream media life, making occasional, purposeful appearances at UFO conferences, smaller community events, and a handful of interviews with outlets that cover paranormal or investigative topics. These limited engagements suggest she remains connected to the ufology community without courting broader celebrity. Outside those appearances, she has maintained a deliberately low profile, reportedly avoiding tabloid publicity and large-scale network television spots. Friends and community contacts describe her as living privately while navigating the lingering emotional and social fallout of the case. Public records and reliable reporting provide no recent independently confirmed details about her exact whereabouts or day-to-day life, which leaves the documentary as the most prominent, widely seen update on her story and ensures that many questions about her current circumstances remain open. These targeted engagements allow her to reach sympathetic or curious audiences while avoiding constant tabloid scrutiny. The series also generated renewed online discussion and media re-examinations, which produced both supportive attention and skeptical scrutiny. As a result, she and her supporters seem to prefer controlled settings, panels, moderated interviews, and small events over frequent national TV appearances. Furthermore, there are no widely verified, up-to-date reports indicating she has sought ongoing mainstream publicity. Instead, public contact has been sporadic and carefully managed. Conclusion: the paradox of extraordinary claims. Regardless of whether one believes Linda's story to be factual or a fabrication, proving either stance remains a profound challenge. We do not have conclusive evidence in either direction. We have testimony, we have recordings, we have investigators with different agendas and different standards of evidence. We have cultural context and narrative precedents, but we do not have definitive proof. After 35 years, the case of Linda Napolitano remains in a state of productive ambiguity. It forces us to confront questions about how we know what is real, how we evaluate testimony, how trauma manifests, and what role belief plays in constructing our understanding of the world. The story also reflects a particular moment in American culture. The 1980s and 1990s saw a flourishing of interest in UFO encounters and alien contact narratives. Television shows and movies explored these themes. Books became bestsellers, support groups formed. There was a cultural hunger for evidence of contact with something beyond ourselves. Linda's story emerged into this receptive cultural environment, shaped by it and possibly shaped by the narrative expectations of that environment. Whether her encounter was genuine or constructed, it was certainly influenced by the culture it emerged within.
Somebody to